The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, was a complex and devastating conflict, rooted in both Vietnam's struggle for independence from colonial rule and the Cold War dynamics between the United States and the Soviet Union. The war became one of the most contentious and traumatic events in U.S. history, deeply affecting Vietnam and the countries involved. Here is a detailed account of the entire story of the Vietnam War. 1. Colonial roots and the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. Vietnam was a French colony, part of French Indochina, for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. During World War II, the Japanese occupied Vietnam, and the Vietnamese resistance grew under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and the communist-led Viet Minh movement. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho declared Vietnam's independence, but France sought to reassert control. This led to the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, between French colonial forces and the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh, supported by China and the Soviet Union, fought for independence, using guerrilla tactics to wear down the French. After a decisive defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the French were forced to negotiate. 2. The Geneva Accords and the division of Vietnam. In 1954, the Geneva Accords were signed, temporarily dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel into two zones: North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and his communist government, and South Vietnam, where the anti-communist government of Emperor Bao Dai was later replaced by President Ngo Dinh Diem. The agreement called for reunification elections in 1956, but they never occurred, as Diem, with U.S. support, refused to hold them, fearing Ho would win. This division marked the beginning of the Vietnam War's second phase, as both sides prepared for an inevitable conflict. North Vietnam sought to reunite the country under communism, while South Vietnam, backed by the U.S., aimed to prevent that from happening. 3. Escalation of the Cold War and U.S. involvement. The Cold War context played a significant role in the U.S.'s growing involvement. After World War II, the U.S. adopted the policy of containment, aimed at preventing the spread of communism. When China fell to communism in 1949 and North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, the U.S. saw Vietnam as a critical battleground in this global struggle. Initially, U.S. involvement was indirect. The Eisenhower administration provided financial and military aid to South Vietnam, hoping to build a strong, non-communist government. But Diem's regime became increasingly corrupt and unpopular, especially due to its harsh repression of Buddhists and rural peasants, many of whom began to support the communist insurgents known as the Viet Cong. 4. The rise of the Viet Cong in the Kennedy years, 1961 to 1963. The Viet Cong, communist guerrillas in South Vietnam, began attacking South Vietnamese government targets in the late 1950s, with increasing support from North Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of supply routes through Laos and Cambodia, allowed North Vietnam to send weapons and troops to the south. Under President John F. Kennedy, U.S. involvement deepened. By 1963, the U.S. had sent over 16,000 military advisors to assist South Vietnam in its fight against the Viet Cong. However, Diem's regime continued to face widespread opposition, culminating in a Buddhist-led protest movement. In November 1963, Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a U.S.-backed coup, further destabilizing South Vietnam. 5. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident and Escalation, 1964 to 1965. Following Diem's death, South Vietnam descended into political chaos. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong's insurgency gained strength. In August 1964, U.S. Navy ships patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin reported being attacked by North Vietnamese forces. Though the details of the incident were unclear, President Lyndon B. Johnson used it as a pretext to escalate U.S. involvement. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed by Congress, gave Johnson broad powers to conduct military operations in Vietnam without formally declaring war. In early 1965, Johnson initiated Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. By the end of the year, U.S. ground troops were deployed in South Vietnam, marking the start of full-scale American military involvement. This escalation transformed the war into a direct confrontation between the U.S. and North Vietnam, though the Viet Cong continued to play a critical role in the South. 6. The war intensifies, 1965 to 1968. From 1965 to 1968, the war escalated dramatically. The U.S. presence grew to over 500,000 troops, and intense battles raged across South Vietnam. However, the U.S. military struggled to adapt to the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics and the unfamiliar jungle terrain. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong employed a strategy of attrition, aiming to exhaust the U.S. and weaken its resolve. Search and destroy missions, air strikes, and defoliation tactics, like the use of Agent Orange, took a heavy toll on both the Vietnamese population and the environment. The war became increasingly brutal, with atrocities like the My Lai massacre in 1968, where U.S. troops killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, shocking the world. 7. The Tet Offensive and shifting U.S. opinion, 1968. In January 1968, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated series of attacks on over 100 South Vietnamese cities and military bases, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Though US and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the offensive, it was a psychological blow. The American public, who had been told the war was nearing an end, began to question whether victory was possible. The Tet Offensive marked a turning point. Anti-war protests in the US grew larger and more vocal, with millions of Americans demanding an end to the war. Walter Cronkite, one of the nation's most respected news anchors, famously declared that the US was mired in stalemate, further eroding public support. 8. Nixon's Vietnamization and the secret bombing campaign, 1969 to 1973. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, promised to achieve peace with honor and began a policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing US troops while transferring more responsibility to the South Vietnamese Army. Despite these efforts, fighting continued, and Nixon secretly expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, conducting massive bombing campaigns to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail and target North Vietnamese bases. These bombings, often hidden from the American public, led to widespread destruction in Cambodia and the eventual rise of the Khmer Rouge, a brutal communist regime. 9. Paris Peace Accords and U.S. withdrawal, 1973. By 1972, the war had become deeply unpopular in the U.S., and Nixon was under increasing pressure to end it. Negotiations with North Vietnam dragged on, but a breakthrough came in January 1973 with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and the release of prisoners of war. Despite the ceasefire, fighting between North and South Vietnam continued. The U.S. withdrew its last combat troops in March 1973, effectively ending its direct involvement in the war. However, the conflict in Vietnam was far from over. 10. The fall of Saigon, 1975. After the U.S. withdrawal, South Vietnam struggled to hold back the North Vietnamese forces. Without American military support, the South Vietnamese army was severely weakened. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched a final offensive, rapidly advancing toward Saigon. On April 30, 1975, the North Vietnamese captured Saigon, and the South Vietnamese government collapsed. The event marked the end of the Vietnam War and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. Images of the chaotic U.S. evacuation, with helicopters airlifting American personnel and Vietnamese refugees from the U.S. Embassy roof, became emblematic of the war's tragic end. 11. Aftermath and legacy, the war left Vietnam devastated. Millions of Vietnamese, civilians, soldiers, and combatants on both sides had been killed. The country's infrastructure was in ruins, and its environment had been scarred by years of bombing and chemical defoliants. For the United States, the war was a national trauma. Over 58,000 American soldiers died, and countless more were physically or psychologically wounded. The war fractured American society, with widespread anti-war protests, distrust of the government, and disillusionment with U.S. foreign policy. Vietnam itself remained under communist rule, with Hanoi becoming the capital of the reunified Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The country faced economic hardship and international isolation for years but eventually began to rebuild, slowly normalizing relations with the U.S. and the global community. The Vietnam War remains a symbol of the limits of military power and the profound consequences of war for both nations and individuals. Its legacy continues to shape U.S. foreign policy and serves as a cautionary tale about the costs of foreign intervention. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel for more such content.